Hello, it's the next 4 chapters of the Twits, and Mrs. Twit has a case of the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra on the stick, he had done the same with the legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing at her like the finger was a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit, "the worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 9 or 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me." "Oh, tell me quickly," she said. "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" said Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. So Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring, and then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its strings, trying to go up and up, and Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied round her neck, others he tied under her arms, some around her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" said Mr. Twit. I can," cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more strings around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit. and with a ghoulish grin on his lip, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings, holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. What a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone for ever." Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and less, and the rate of her climb slowed down. When she'd bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. So I wonder what's going to happen next. How do you think Mr. Twit's going to feel when he finds out that Mrs. Twit is coming down after his lovely surprise for her? Until next time.